Ladies, gentlemen, and all friends besides, I think it's time I shook things up a little with these video essays. This month, I'm not going to focus on any one specific country. This month, I've got my eyes on the very top prize. Allow me, if you will, to present my grand, unified, academically supported theory on what it takes to win the Eurovision Song Contest. Let's do this! Hello everyone, I am Tessellating Hexagons, or, well, actually, due to a loophole in the laws of my country, I'm quietly confident that I'm Professorlating Hexagons, actually. You see, in the dim and distant year of 2013, I wrote a modest 7,500 word thesis on what it takes to win Eurovision, and unless I'm quite mistaken, you don't actually need any specific qualification to call yourself a professor here, just a qualification in any given subject. Well, even if that's not how it works, I'd still like to think of myself as some kind of Eurovision authority anyway. You trust me, don't you? So, I feel as though the time is quite pertinent for me to update that paper and transform it into a Patreon video or two. Yeah, this isn't going to be a single video, we do have a lot to get through, and I don't want to rush through things just to keep it under 20 minutes. So to elaborate on that, and in lieu of my usual fast facts, I'll be splitting my overall theory the same way I divided my thesis, into 4 key areas that one needs to address in order to win, which, quite snazzily, all begin with the letter S. My 4 S's, as I like to call them, are as follows. Number 1. Sentiment. That is, getting your country to believe in the contest's legitimacy before anything else, before even starting anything else. If your own country doesn't believe in you, why should anyone else? Think about that. Number 2, the singer. Who is going to be the face of your country for the next year, and what sort of personality should they have? How do you find the right balance of talent, charisma, and overall presence? There is a lot to think about there. Thirdly, the song. Arguably the most important part, bearing in mind it's the Eurovision Song Contest, after all. What subject matter works best, and in what format? How does that all come together? And following on from that, point number 4, staging. I touched upon this briefly in my top 10 stage performances video, and for good reason. A good song can lose all credibility without a solid stage presence to back it up, and, by that same token, a more overlooked song can turn into a dark horse with the right stage composition on the night. It's a powerful thing to mess with, so make sure you get it right. Now, having laid out that groundwork, I'm going to begin by establishing that in this video, we're just going to look at those first 2 points, because, well, I want to go into a certain amount of detail with each point, and I wouldn't want to rush through all 4 points, like I said. I do have a fair level of academic pride here. This is, after all, based on a lengthy essay that I wrote in college, though, I should throw a little something out there before we dive in, just so that we're all on the same page. When I wrote the dissertation that this video is based on, I had to first pitch my idea to a board of my peers and my project supervisor. During that presentation, I opened with one point that's highly relevant and that you should keep in mind when watching this video. There is no one single formula that leads to guaranteed victory. In fact, you could boil down my ideas to the simple 2-word phrase, know thyself. Obviously, it's going to take some expounding upon, but that's the general gist of it. Anyway, I wrote that whole thing before the 2014 contest, and everything I said in it, right down to the there's no one formula part, has only become more relevant since, particularly in the wake of 2017's contest, where if you told someone from 5 years ago that the top 3 would be Portugal, Bulgaria, and Moldova, they would most likely just laugh in your face. But I digress. My overall point is, this video is just the foundation from which to build a successful Eurovision campaign, not the secret cheat code to guarantee 12 points across the board on the night. So, with that in mind, let's get this thing started. Alrighty, let's begin at the beginning, and I do list those points in a specific order for good reason. If nothing else, it serves as a rough timeline for where one's strategy should start, and what points it should hit along the way as it progresses. And the first stop on that tour is what I like to call sentiment. What I mean by that is, if you expect your entry to be taken seriously, you have to get your own country excited enough to take it seriously. In short, as I said before, if your own country won't take the entry seriously, why should anyone else? Why should any other country think about your song twice if you won't? And if you think this is a bit too abstract of a point to play a role in a winning strategy, allow me to offer no fewer than 3.5 pieces of compelling evidence. First up, Sweden. And it's not the first time that Sweden and first have been thrust so unceremoniously together like that, but I already did a video covering their absolute domination of the contest, so moving on, that's my point. Sweden takes the contest so deadly seriously. It's a family event, as is their mammoth national vinyl process. Tickets for that sell out, not just for the final, but the semi-finals, the second chance round, and all of the rehearsals of all of those shows. There is nobody in Sweden who hasn't heard of Melodifestivalen, and by extension, Eurovision. Even those who aren't fans at least acknowledge its scale and legitimacy. And what do they have to show for it? At the time of recording, 6 wins, and a whole load of top 5 finishes, and an absolute landslide of wins in the OGAE Second Chance contest, including a 16th one between when I released my video about Sweden on Patreon, and then when that reached YouTube, just to make me look bad about fact-checking. But, point made, let's move on before I get too sidetracked about Sweden again. Second piece of evidence, Germany. And this is a bit of a funny case study. In particular, let's look at the past 5 years, where they've done little besides languish at the bottom of the scoreboard consistently. Germany seems to have caught that toxic plague of cynicism started by a certain BBC commentator in the 20th century, naming no names. While perhaps they don't have it quite as bad, they do have some level of disdain or impatience with the contest, and their results really do reflect that. In 2015, for example, the German public gave Anne-Sophie a ridiculously hard time of things just because the actual winner of the national final that year gave the prize to her instead, forfeiting his victory, which wasn't even her fault. Still, that stigma stuck, and she finished last on the night and with no points, despite having what I thought was an excellent song. While we're thinking about that, by the way, look at Spain this year, 2017 that is. Some of the more obsessive Spanish fans, or Spanners as I took to calling them, hated on Manel Navarro to the extreme, just because they were salty over their favourite, Mirella, not winning the national final, and to such an extent that there were people in the audience at the contest, in the final, holding Spanish flags with the name Mirella printed on them in bold black ink. Lo and behold, Manel finished stone dead last at the end of the voting. Yeah, his performance wasn't great, but look, his own country hated him, so why would anyone else believe in him? And lastly, third and a halfly, 2 big old case studies that are Ireland and the United Kingdom. I say this counts as a point and a half because they're 2 countries that both demonstrate the same point. Sweden's going strong, and it shows. Germany and Spain aren't doing too well with their public, and it shows. And now we have 2 countries whose opinions of the contest have shifted, and in one case still are shifting. Between them, the British Isles are, bar none, the most successful region in the contest. You might want to dispute that for a number of reasons, but the long and short of it is, the UK has won 5 times, Ireland has won 7 times, and they have a further 23 podium finishes between them, most of which coming from the UK. But here's the problem. Only one of those podium finishes was in the 21st century, and even then, just barely. It just so happens that, over time, opinions of the contest began to sour over here, and, surprise surprise, the results for both countries started to falter along with that. Spin forward to the present day, and Ireland haven't qualified since 2013, and even then they came last in the final. Meanwhile, sure, the UK had one lucky break in 2009, coming 5th, but overall, they've done so badly that the country's reputation at Eurovision, and Eurovision as a whole, is nothing more than a national joke. And that hurts to live with. But there is some hope there. In the past couple of years, those fortunes have, slowly, ever so slowly, begun to turn for the UK, and wouldn't you know it, it just so happens that this coincides with the BBC starting to invest more time and care into promoting the contest to the British public. Perhaps part of that is the decision to invest in a national final, and then bidding to make a return on that investment by encouraging people to take it seriously, but if so, that just bolsters my point. If you build it, they will come. That is, if you build your reputation, they'll give you points. The idea is there. And the easiest way to do that is, quite simply, present the contest in a positive light. No more jokes about funny foreigners, no more wheeling out the old excuses of, oh, it's all political, nobody likes us, blah blah Brexit. Just present it as it is, an annual festival of music. No more, it's a gay thing, no straights allowed. No more, it's just a niche thing, no normies allowed. No more, it's a joke, you must laugh. If you have a history of poor results, suck it up and move on. Show this 60-year-old behemoth of an event the respect it deserves. It just might respect you back. Having said all of that though, and I don't mean to detract from any of that because it is a load of perfectly valid points, I should know, I wrote them in the first place, but despite what any number of children's cartoons will tell you, just believing in yourself isn't good enough in a vacuum. Yes, it's a vital stepping stone to being taken seriously, and being taken seriously is a prerequisite for winning, but we need to talk about what exactly it is that you're so vehemently believing in. For the moment, let's just focus on the person, or people, or, to put it in terms of my 4 S's, the singer, and not anything else they might be bringing to the table performance-wise. On paper, this sounds like a no-brainer. Just pick someone who can sing your chosen song, right? Well, I'm sure you can tell just by the way that I'm building this up that of course it's not that easy. Is it ever? That is to say, there's a whole host of things to consider when thinking about singers. Obviously, their capacity to perform live is a huge factor. If you can't sing in tune at all, your entry will be viewed as a joke and nothing more. And if your studio recording is fine but your live vocals are terrible, you'll flop. There is no ulterior anything to that, you will just flop. But this all goes without saying. The next really obvious point to consider is how the candidate presents themselves on stage. For one, there's how seriously they take themselves. To a point, they don't have to take themselves super seriously, sure, but if they encourage the audience to laugh with or at them, then that's going to supersede any serious emotional impact the performance is going to have. Really, their attitude should match the song and their personal aesthetic, but having at least some degree of self-respect helps encourage the audience to empathize with them instead of expending all of their energy laughing at them. You see what I'm driving at? The other thing regarding self-presentation, though, is something that's apparent before they even open their mouth: physical appearance. Now, I'm not going to be discriminatory against gender identity or body type or anything like that, goodness no. Eurovision winners come in all configurations of appearance. Rather, I'm talking about their choice of costume. If it's too out there, it'll break the audience's immersion. You might immediately think of Lordi as a counterpoint to that statement, but I disagree. In Lordi's case, sure, their outfits were over the top, but they matched the song down to the ground. It was part of their image, which was coherent and cohesive. So, perhaps this line of argument blurs the line between singer and staging somewhat, but that's the point here. You don't have to rock up in a business suit, it just has to match your song and identity. The best example of this is 2016's Jamie Lee Krivitz, also from Germany, who dressed to match her own personal aesthetic at the cost of representing her song. Accordingly, despite how good the song itself was, she came last. Of course, there's nothing wrong with sending an artist with a strong personal aesthetic, they just need to know when to let their flag fly and when to rein it in a bit. On a similar note, there's the act's outward personality. For everything I've said about sentiment, you should realise that perhaps it's not critical, but it is certainly very helpful if your representative likes Eurovision. That is to say, if they view it with disdain or as just another gig, they're immediately going to come across as arrogant and hard to engage with, and largely that's not going to engender support from the audience, and thus that won't translate into points. Trust me. Conversely, if they're humble, familiar with the contest, even if it's just knowing about the previous year or so, it already makes a really good first impression right away, and so, as a character, they become much more likable and hence more vote forable. I think there might be a word for that and I don't remember what it is. Now, as far as my personal tastes go, I strongly advise against sending actual characters, by the way. Like, Sylvia Knight and Dustin the Turkey both fell flat for their countries because, what a surprise, nobody outside of their home country understands the character, so they don't get the joke. All they see is a weird-looking puppet with a broken sense of humour. All they see is an angry Icelandic woman who's really mean and unpleasant to her fellow competitors. They don't see it as a character performance, they just see it as an act who has no sense of decorum, and thus, it's harder to vote for them. That said, you could argue that Conchita was a character of sorts and yet still won, but I would say, given the way that Tom Neuwirth has spoken about her and the way he portrayed her, I would describe Conchita as an alter ego rather than a character. That is to say, she wasn't intended to be a parody or an exaggeration of an existing person or personality, she's just another self, so she comes across completely naturally. And one last thing on the subject of the singer, or singers, consider their on-stage presence once more. Now that we've covered how they hold themselves and how they dress, let's give due thought to the actual performance they're going to give. Without treading too much on the toes of the subject of staging, I want to bring up how the singer interacts with the stage they're given. Are they better suited to more or less choreography as they sing? Can they handle that? Some singers, you see, get out of breath really easily, and if dancing impacts their singing quality at all, then that will affect how the song is received. Bad choreography can be overlooked, but bad singing is much harder to let go of. Secondly, does your singer have good rapport with other people? Should they have backing dancers, and if so, should they interact with them? And the same question applies to props. Do they need them, or can they convey enough meaning without them? I leave all these questions deliberately open-ended because, in this instance, there isn't a hard and fast answer that I can give that applies to every entrant ever. Rather, this is something that has to be kept in mind when putting together a performance. Either build a stage presence around what you know your artist is capable of, or build a stage concept and song ahead of time and then give it to an artist whose talents play directly into realizing that concept. In the nicest possible way, the performer is one of the tools used to bring a song to life, and to an extent, they sort of need to be thought of as such, whilst still being treated like a human person, of course. Please don't forget about that element. Good leg. Now, so far, I've been talking about potential candidates as if they're guaranteed to always be one person, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. If you want to try to compile a winning entry based on statistics of what won in the past, then yes, I'll cut the nonsense and tell you that you want a 25 to 40-year-old female solo artist singing in English. But that's just by pure weight of numbers, and that's glossing over so much. In the real world, well, for one, gender isn't really a huge deal. The past 10 winners have actually had a surprising amount of balance between them as far as that goes. In fact, the only real solid things you can extrapolate from them is that Europe tends to prefer relatively young-ish singers who perform on their own, and by itself, that's really not hugely helpful. But there is one thing I will append to that conclusion. I'll make the argument, here and now, that the last 10 winners, not counting Elle and Nikki, didn't win because they were soloists, but rather, as an act, they were optimized to perform alone, in the same way that Elle and Nikki are optimized as performers to perform as a duo, or that Lordi is optimized to perform as a group. That is to say, if Mr. Lordi had presented Hard Rock Hallelujah by himself with no one else on stage, it most likely would have flopped. If Jamala had had a whole choir joining her in her Crimean Tatar refrain, the meaning would have been watered down significantly to the point of it no longer making that emotional connection. So really, the main takeaway here isn't that there's a biological archetype for Eurovision winners, so that's not the direction you should be thinking in at all. Instead, when it comes to picking a performer, just consider their aptitude for performing live and their attitude towards the contest and Europe. So think of aptitude and attitude. Just keep those two words in mind and you should be fine. The rest will follow surprisingly naturally, I assure you. Alright, I think that's enough coverage for the first half of my dissertation, so let's recap on what I've touched upon so far. I spoke of sentiment, which I defined as getting your country to believe in the contest, and to believe in their own ability to compete in the contest competently. This can be achieved by presenting the contest in a positive light within media, both major and personal or social, and by giving domestic Eurovision-related projects adequate funding. Overall, stop viewing the contest as some kind of cheesy gimmick and start treating it with the respect it deserves after its rich, still expanding 62-year history. I spoke also of what to keep in mind when selecting a singer. I advise against prioritizing candidates based on age, gender and linguistic preference, and instead advocate focusing on their suitability to the Eurovision stage and their attitude and self-presentation. Avoid arrogance and snobbery, and promote people who are eager to learn. An extensive knowledge of Eurovision history isn't required, but a good knowledge of European geography does help. For instance, it wouldn't make a good impression to mix up Budapest and Bucharest when talking to the Romanian delegation, now would it? And that's more or less it. As I said at the top of this video, what this all boils down to is each delegation simply knowing themselves inside and out, knowing what their country would need to hear in order to support the contest, knowing what kinds of artists are available and what sort of media training they need in order to best represent their country, and knowing that Eurovision victory isn't reserved for the same privileged few countries every year. All it takes is the right kind of work. But this is where I sign off for the time being. I would love to go into more detail about the next couple of points, but that's reserved for the next video. So for now, as ever, a hearty thank you so much for watching, and a bonus thank you for the lovely people supporting me on Patreon, who get to watch these videos a month in advance. By the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can go over to patreon.com/tesshex and watch part 2 of this video right now. Like, that's it, it's available, you can go and watch it. And you can hear me talk about what sort of song you need in order to win, and how to stage it. And to generally wrap this entire set of theories into a neat little package once and for all. And on top of that, not only is there another video available to watch over there right now anyway as well as that, but just by signing up you get access to a whole load of bonus perks as well. And on top of that, my undying gratitude as well. Which, I mean, that's all the perk you need, right? Right? But for now, I will leave that thought with you, because I have been, and will continue to be, Tessellating Hexagons, and I shall see you when next I see you, which is hopefully going to be very soon indeed.